So good afternoon all. Today we are fortunate to have all great teachers for chairing our session. The chairperson today is Dr. Vaishali Une, who is the Associate Professor and Head of the Department at Dhule GMC. And she has many accolades to her credit as national, international presentations and publications. Our co-chairperson is Dr. Jyotika Mishri-Kodkar ma'am. She is a professor and head of the department at MGM Medical College, Aurangabad, who has a vast teaching experience of 28 years. And she too has many presentations and publications to her credit. And last but not the least, our second co-chairperson is Dr. Rajesh Sinha, who really needs no introduction. He is the professor and of cornea anterior segment, cataract surgery and refract surgery at AIIMS. He's the joint treasurer of AIOS, and with 325 publications to his credit, it is really indeed a pleasure to have you here, sir, today. Thank you so much for coming. And lastly, I would introduce Dr. Neha, the moderator. I don't see her. She is a young, bright ophthalmologist.
ILNP in management of
practicing from
retinal detachment.
I think someone.
Congratulations, Dr. Bhavan Pudesa.
Dr. Snehal, hi, good morning.
Good morning, ma'am. Actually, I'm searching for the moderator.
I know. So, Dr. Snehal,
I would
like to. Good morning, Rajesh Bhaiya.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rajesh
Rajesh
Bhaiya. Good morning. Good morning, Jyotika ma'am. Everybody, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Deshmukh ma'am. So, hi, Jyotika ma'am. Snehal,
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So, everybody, Snehal has made a lot of effort, and I think a complete effort to put this lovely session together. I really take this opportunity to thank Dr. Snehal for this beautiful lineup of stalwarts, and thank you, Rajesh bhai, Jyotika ma'am, Dr. Pradnya ma'am, and Mitali ma'am, and everybody here. Snehal, over to you.
Very much.
And I won't interrupt your session. I just wanted to say hello and thank you.
So,
Some difficulty?
Recording in progress. Also given to Dr. Prashant.
I think the awards function is getting relayed here.
Neha, you're on mute.
Okay. So I'll introduce Mitali Shah. She has completed her MS from MGM Medical College, Aurangabad, and she has completed long-term pediatric ophthalmic fellowship from LV Prasad. I request her to please give her talk on allergic conjunctivitis. Thank you. Mitali, please share your screen.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
My screen is visible?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Today we will discussing the allergic conjunctivitis. Seasonal allergic conjunctivitis and VKC are the most common type of allergic conjunctivitis which we come across in our day-to-day OPD. Seasonal allergic conjunctivitis is IgE-mediated inflammatory response, and the clinical features are itching, redness, and chemosis. Different classes of drugs are available, but most of the time, vasoconstrictor and antihistaminic will suffice. VKC is the most common chronic, most difficult type of allergic conjunctivitis to treat. Epidemiology of VKC is described by Sangwan et al. In IJO 2013 in retrospective study in detail. Etiopathogenesis of VKC is same as the seasonal allergic conjunctivitis. Only difference is in VKC is a IgE with T-cell bound mast cell stimulation, and that's why the inflammation is more as compared to seasonal allergic conjunctivitis. The clinical features of VKC is same as all other allergic conjunctivitis. Tarsal form of VKC is graded as small, medium to giant, and the cobblestone papillae. Whereas in limbal form, we can see the flat, elevated, and the confluent papillae. In corneal involvement, it can vary from superficial punctate erosions, microerosions, macroerosions, and the shield ulcer. Progression of disease can lead to keratoconus, astigmatism, limbal stem cell deficiency, and shield ulcer. Once the diagnosis is made, grading of the VKC is important to select appropriate treatment. If we follow the classification given by the Bonini et al., we can see that from grade 0 to grade 2A, there is only conjunctival involvement, whereas in grade 2B, there is a little amount of a corneal involvement. In grade 3, we will get the limbal involvement along with the little corneal involvement, and in grade 4, there is a shield ulcer. The another classification is given by the Gokhale et al. And published in the ISO 2016. According to them, in mild grade, we will have the conjunctival inflammation. In moderate to intermittent, we'll have the little limbal involvement and the corneal involvement. And the intermittent disease they have written is inflammation of and medicine of period more than 2 to 3 months or maximum 3 to 4 episodes per year. In moderate and chronic, we'll have the cobblestone papillae. Chronic disease they have defined as an inflammation-free or medicine-free period less than 1 month. In severe classification, we'll have the exaggerated conjunctival form, limbal form, and the corneal form, but we will not see the shield ulcer. Whereas in blinding, we will see there all other signs are present along with the shield ulcer and the limbal stem cell deficiency. Shield ulcer is graded as a grade 1 if the base is clear. Inflammatory debris with base is grade 2 and the elevated plaque as a grade 3. All grades of VKC require non-pharmacological treatment in the form of protective glasses, avoid exposure to allergen, change of residence or workplace, cold compression, and avoid eye rubbing. Coming to the treatment, different classes of drugs are available for the treatment of the allergic conjunctivitis, such as vasoconstrictor, antihistaminic, mast cell stabilizer. In mast cell stabilizer, we have to start the drug as a prophylactic agent, and the dual acting agent having the action antihistaminic and the mast cell stabilizing. The drug available are the olopatadine, bipotastine, alcaftidine. It has to be given for a longer period like 2 or 3 months, which reduces the frequency of the disease. Coming to the corticosteroid, we have the soft steroids and the potent steroids. In soft steroids, we have lotepred and the FML. If we compare the lotepred with the FML, lotepred has the more conjunctival penetration than the FML. These are called as a soft drugs because they have the lesser intraocular penetration, and that's why the side effects like the cataract and glaucoma, which are associated with the potent steroids, are the less. Now coming to the immunomodulators, we have the cyclosporine. The available commercial strength of the cyclosporine is the 0.05% to 0.1%. But for the treatment of the VKC, the concentration required is more. That is to be ranging from the 0.5% to the 2%, which can be formulated by mixing the commercial available injection cyclosporine, and also the orosporine 2% is available commercially. Coming to the tacrolimus, it was originally prepared as a dermatological preparations, but nowadays the tacrolimus eye ointment is also available. If the conjunctival application tolerance is poor, we can shift to the eyelid application. Coming to the treatment protocol, if it is a mild VKC, we should start avoidance of the allergen, lubrication, and the dual acting agent. If it is a moderate intermittent, we should add the lotepred in pulse. Means we can give for the 4 times a day for a week and then stop it. If it is a moderate and chronic, we will shift from the lotepred pulse to the lotepred tapering fashion. Means it should be given like 4-3-2-1 for a longer period of time and added with the cyclosporine at 0.5%. If it is a severe, we should change from the lotepred to the potent steroid, and the concentration of the immunomodulator drug should be increased. If there is a presence of a shield ulcer, sometimes there is needed to start the oral steroid, and the surgical treatment is required for the grade 3 shield ulcer. For the surgical treatment for the papillae, we should do the we can go ahead with the supratarsal steroid injection, cryotherapy, and the excision of the papillae. GPC and atopic keratoconjunctivitis are the other types of the allergic conjunctivitis. Now coming to the some cases, here we can see there is a papillary conjunctival involvement along with the limbal involvement, but there is a no corneal involvement. It is graded as a moderate intermittent type of a VKC, and then we'll follow the algorithm like the avoidance of the allergen, lubricating, dual acting agent, and the lotepred is given in the pulses. Now here we can see there is a no limbal involvement, no corneal involvement, only the conjunctival involvement. It is graded as a mild VKC, and we will follow like the avoidance of allergen, lubricating, and the dual acting agent. Here we can see there is a conjunctival involvement along with the limbal involvement, and there is a superficial punctate keratitis. It is graded as a moderate intermittent, and the same algorithm like the ALHM with the lotepred pulse is started. Here we can see there is an exaggerated conjunctival reaction, limbal reaction, and the corneal reaction. It is graded as a moderate chronic, and all the treatment is given, and the lotepred pulse is converted into the lotepred tapering fashion, and along with the cyclosporine started. Now here we can see there is a shield ulcer, then it is graded as a blinding condition, and all the treatment like our protocol ALHM is started, and the potent steroid can be given in the pulse fashion or in the tapering fashion along with the immunomodulators and the plaque debridement along with the amniotic membrane transplant. And for the severe grade papillae, we can give the supratarsal steroids. My take-home message from this presentation is grading of VKC, treatment protocol, guide us to use potent steroid appropriately, exact time to start steroid sparing agent, which will arrest the progression of disease and prevent the complication like cataract and glaucoma. I would like to thank Dr. Thakre Madam and the MOS committee for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That was an excellent talk. It gives me great pleasure to invite our next speaker. We have Dr. Rajesh Sinha, who is a renowned cornea surgeon, and he'll be talking about pediatric corneal trauma today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Mithali, and thank you, Dr. Ragini and Dr. Thakre, ma'am, for inviting me in this session. I'll be talking about pediatric corneal trauma. Now, this is a certain topic which, situation which we encounter very often. We, in our emergencies, we do get cases of pediatric corneal trauma, wherein we have to manage the patient as soon as possible. So this ocular trauma accounts for nearly 8 to 14% of total childhood injuries, and it can be blunt, penetrating, or can be blast injury, can be chemical injury. And long back in 2002, we had published this article wherein we found out that we just published an article related to pattern of pediatric ocular trauma in India. And we found out that the household appliances and the bow and arrow injury, particularly bow and arrow injury, was more commonly seen because the study was done in the northern part of the country, wherein in the second half of the year, wherein Deepavali and Dussehra, after these festivals, children like to play with bow and arrow. So that was one common cause. But another very important cause was, unsupervised sport. And we concluded that children should be supervised when they are playing with anything. Particularly, one should avoid using sharp instruments. Another article which was published from our center was bursting of tuna packets causing alkali burn in children. So all these injuries are very commonly seen. Now, corneal laceration, which we do encounter in our day-to-day practice in our emergencies, is something which is very commonly seen in children. And it can be partial thickness, it can be full thickness. Now, if it's a partial thickness, but if the flap, if there's no avulsion kind of thing, or there's no separation of the edges, then in that case, you can just put a bandage contact lens and that will manage. But if the margins are, apart, then in that case, you have to put a suture, even in a partial thickness laceration. In a full thickness laceration, you have to put a suture or multiple sutures depending upon the type of injury. Now, if it's just a incarceration, you can repair it. If there is UL incarceration, you have to reposit, or you have to abscise partially or totally full thickness of the tissue which remained incarcerated or prolapsed for a long period. If it's more than 72 hours period, then there's always the risk of causing endophthalmitis and infection in the eye if the tissue is reposited in the same manner. So it should be partially removed, or a layer, a membrane can be removed, and that is how we can prevent infection. And of course, intracameral antibiotic, etc., helps a lot. Now, as far as anesthesia is concerned, in children, there is no other option. The only option left is general anesthesia. Even in adults, one should try to avoid topical or local anesthesia. When there is a adnexal injury as well as the globe injury, so the globe injury has to be repaired first, followed by adnexal injury. Certain things that we have to follow, like the corneal wound is repaired with a 10-ohm monofilament nylon suture, while the scleral wound can be closed with a polygalactin suture. Then if in a corneal injury, if there are bends, then the bends have to be handled first. The limb, if it's involving the limbus, then the limbus has to be managed first, because if you oppose the limbus, because this is a landmark which is very clearly visible, so which demarcates cornea and sclera. So apposition of the landmark is essential in order to maintain regularity of the corneal tissue, and that is very essential. So limbus first, and then of course any bend. And then, of course, the suture should be placed in such a way that if you make a triangle, then the edges should oppose. So the distance of the suture should be in such a way that it should form a triangle with the ends opposing. So that is how it should be done. And if the corneal injury is involving the central part of the cornea, then the suture's bite should be small, because suture bite can also cause some scarring. So the bite in the center should be small. As you go to the periphery, the bite will be bigger. And if you are doing, if it's a corneal scleral laceration, then in that case, the corneal suturing is done first limbus, then cornea, and then sclera. That is the usual trend. But there are certain scenarios wherein you can do sclera first as well, in order to maintain the regularity of the globe. And I'll just show a couple of case scenarios. This is a case of a corneal perforation, wherein there's a uveal prolapse. So you have to create a paracentesis first, inject viscoelastic, and then release this uveal tissue incarcerated from the wound, from the paracentesis. Don't try to push it from the main wound. So you have to create a paracentesis, and then you put sutures, and then you can put a suture in the periphery. Both peripheries can be sutured, and then you keep bisecting. This is how you should do, and that will be the end of it. Now, if you have a corneoscleral perforation, then as you can see here, there is so much of membrane formation as well. So you have to do a little bit of peritomy to see how much is the scleral involvement. And then once you have done it, the first suture, as you can see here, is the alignment of the limbus. And after aligning the limbus, what you do is that you, through the paracentesis, you try to reposit the iris tissue as well as, in the anterior chamber, then put a suture in the periphery. So one periphery has already been, secured. Then you put another, and then you keep bisecting. So you have put one suture here, one here, and then you will put in the center. So you will keep bisecting the sutures, then you bisect here, then you bisect here. And this is how you keep bisecting. And then after that, you put a scleral suture, and that is how you close the globe. Now, some people do prefer putting scleral sutures first. If you do feel that, majority feel corneal sutures should be put first after the limbus. But in some scenarios when the globe is collapsing badly, there's a lot of vitreous has been lost. In that case, you may do a scleral suturing first, and then, secure the integrity of the globe and complete the corneal suturing. If there's a tissue loss, then in that case, you have to do a patch graft. You may use a conjunctival flap as well. You may use amniotic membrane. And of course, a very small, defect or fistula can be healed with a glue. Corneal foreign body, if you see a patient, if the child is complaining of something entering into the eye, causing irritation, etc., one should definitely be examined on slit lamp, and the foreign body, if it is visible, should be removed with the help of a needle. Sometimes the child doesn't cooperate. If it's a small child, then in that case, it has to be done under general anesthesia. As far as chemical injury is concerned, the goal of management is to remove the chemical and check the pH. So wash the eye, that is the most important thing. And then once you have completely washed, wait for 5 minutes and then check the pH. And if the pH is normal, then it is complete. And then, of course, to remove the particulate matter, you have to do of lid to remove the particulate matter, evaluate the damage. And after evaluating the damage, you have to manage the patient conservatively with the help of vitamin C, citrate, lubricants, steroid initially. And you have to remove the particulate matter as well. And amniotic membrane sometimes helps quite a lot in terms of relieving pain as well as epithelial healing in acute cases. So in conclusion, trauma is common in children, and most commonly it is the unsupervised sport that is played either inside home or outside that can cause damage to the cornea. Prompt and meticulous management is something which is very essential because these children have a long life to live, and in order to provide a good life for the children, a prompt and immediate management is very essential. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Any question, I will be willing to answer.
So I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Is the incidence of sympathetic ophthalmitis same as in adults for sclerocorneal perforations?
See, the point is this, that there's no comparative study, first of all, between children and adults in terms of sympathetic ophthalmia. So it is very difficult to say whether it is the same. The second point is this, that, in the current era wherein we have the management options has become so good that sympathetic ophthalmia is extremely rare these days. So since the condition itself is so rare that a comparative study between children and adults is going to be extremely difficult. So that is why there's no comparative study. So I may not be able to tell you the exact difference.
But have you any, do you have any experience of a child going into sympathetic ophthalmitis because of a large scleral perforation?
Not really, not really.
Okay.
I'm yet to see a child with a sympathetic ophthalmia because of a large perforation. I would like to have opinion from others if they have seen it. So,
Une ma'am, any comments from you?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rajesh sir. Excellent videos, and the technique was really helpful. And no, I haven't also seen any endophthalmitis in pediatric age group as such. Means, though we have sutured some very badly damaged cornea also, but fortunately enough, no endophthalmitis in.
no, but she is asking about sympathetic ophthalmia. So sympathetic ophthalmia, that's what you asked, no?
Yes. She asked about sympathetic ophthalmitis.
Okay.
Yes, I've asked about sympathetic ophthalmitis.
So I have seen endophthalmitis cases following trauma, but sympathetic ophthalmia in children, I'm yet to see a case. It is extremely rare condition. 0.01% is the prevalence, and most of the times all these studies have been done long back when the management was not that good. Now in current scenario, if you ask somebody who has done his post-graduation in the last 10 years, they may not have seen a case of sympathetic ophthalmia. So it's so uncommon, extremely rare, that it is something which I guess in current scenario is not a great cause of concern.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We next have Dr. Gaurav Luthra. Dr. Luthra, as we know, is the director of Drishti Eye Institute at Dehradun. He is also the chairman ARC of IIRSI, besides being in the managing committee of AIOS. Sir is also the chairman of awards committee of the Uttarakhand State Ophthalmic Association. He would be taking us through challenging pediatric cataract situations today. So you may start.
Thank you so much and very good afternoon to everyone, and sorry for running late 5-10 minutes. And very nice talk, Rajesh. I got the second half of the talk. Thank you. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. So I enjoy doing pediatric cataract surgery, and while I'm probably not in the league of some of the big pediatric cataract surgeons, but I'll try to share a few of the things that I've learned along the way. So this was one young child with bilateral, he's a case of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis with a very bad band-shaped keratopathy and a bad healed uveitis. So we had to do a 2-stage surgery where we first removed the band-shaped keratopathy and then waited 2-3 months for the cornea to stabilize. So after that, we realized that the patient had significant astigmatism, and this was when we decided to operate him later. And I did not do the band-shaped keratopathy removal. That was done by a cornea surgeon, and then I was given the task of treating the cataract. And here you can see that the synechia can be really bad. Most of these children have very bad festooned pupils, and you have to be gentle, yet you have to get these pupillary membranes off. Sometimes you have to cut them, sometimes you can peel them, and sometimes you can tease them. And you can then, I like to do this removal under viscoelastic plus infusion. So you can see that in my other hand is an infusion, which is constantly running, and that allows for the chamber to be stable and for the pigment to be cleared up as you go around doing the cleaning up process. And then you want to basically have a proper area for you to be able to proceed with the surgery. And of course, you'll see that a lot of the pigment can remain attached to the lens, and that can be dealt with later. Basically, you want to get a rhexis of a good size so that later on, if synechia do form, they will usually form till the edge of the rhexis. Now, in this case, we managed to get a slightly irregularly small rhexis, but I made up for it a little later, and I was able to complete the rhexis, but I had to still deal with some of the other challenges of the surgery and get the pigment cleared up from here. And then of course, remove the cataract is not such a big deal. And once that is done, here we were planning to put in a toric lens. Patient had significant astigmatism of about 2 diopters and was old enough, I think was in the range of about 8 or 9 years. So correcting the astigmatism was more predictable. And after this remained the challenge of enlarging the rhexis, because I didn't want to leave him with a smallish rhexis. Cleared off all the pigment there, and you can see that it's quite easy to do that. I don't like to put in viscoelastic very often, except right at the beginning of surgery during the rhexis. And later stages, I avoid putting any viscoelastic, and you can cut off some of these finer things which are hanging around from the pupil to get a perfectly sized pupil. And side port scissors are very good. These are MST scissors, I think, and they are very reliable. And now I want to enlarge the rhexis. So we'll manage to create a bigger rhexis here. So these cases are very gratifying, and you can finish off with a good procedure in the end. This child did well. We did both eyes. Both eyes had a similar kind of a situation, and I'd like to do the trypan blue test to check for any leakage at the end of surgery. I checked the IOP. This is how it looked like 15 days post-op. Pretty much, in fact, we did a toric check on the eye trace. Astigmatism was quite well corrected. So it was suggesting a 10 degrees rotation would give us a 0.3 improvement in correction of astigmatism, which is a good result. And the child did quite well and gain well, but that's usually not the end of the story. They need to be nurtured through because they'll continue to have issues. And going on, let me take you to, since our time is going to be limited, so I'll take you to another surgery. So here, this is an old surgery, but again here, this child had very high astigmatism, and we have now about 50 plus children with correction of astigmatism, but all of them have to be relatively older. You can't do it in small children. So once the astigmatism is more predictable and easy to measure, I think we've had very gratifying results over the last 5-6 years that we've done torics in children over the age of 6 years or so. And yes, they may later on still have some uncorrected astigmatism as they grow up. But if 80% or 90% of it is corrected, it still helps a lot. If they're left with say half or one diopter or in that range, then usually it helps. So here we had a PC plaque, and we were anyway intending to do a primary rhexis. And then you can obviously put viscoelastic, but not so much that the PC goes down too far, and have a relatively good fill of the chamber, but not a very deep fill. And then you can go with a controlled forceps. This is one of my older forceps, which I no longer use. Now we have a newly designed forceps, which works very well. And sometimes they are friable and unpredictable, but you can still usually manage. In fact, I find doing the posterior rhexis a little easier than the anterior one because it's more controlled. Yet, in some cases, as I'll show you probably in one of the later cases, where it can sometimes be a challenge to get the primary rhexis correctly. So here we were able to complete it and put in the lens into the bag and get a fairly well positioned IOL. A single piece lens. If your posterior rhexis is of the right size and you've not disturbed too much of the vitreous, you can do a vitrectomy in that case. And then here we did not do a sometimes you can. So here we were able to. This is a supraincisional pocket which I make, and I don't suture these children's corneas because that will induce astigmatism, and this is good enough to get a good seal of the cornea. So it's just a pocket which is created anterior to the main incision and hydrated. So going on. Let me take you, since we have limited time, I'll just go on to the next one. And this is again a pediatric cataract where we do a smaller rhexis. It was an intumescent one. So here what we are planning to do probably is to make a smaller rhexis first and then enlarge it. And usually they're decompressing the lens as well and ensuring that the intumescence is controlled. And then you can go for a second round. And usually this is easier to more predictable and usually never runs out. So making a small rhexis first and then completing it with under viscoat, this frill of capsule will usually not run out and allows you to get a bigger rhexis. Once that is done, of course, doing the surgery is easy, but then doing the rhexis. So this was, I think, the case which I wanted to share where sometimes it can be challenging. We lifted up the small flap and then decided that we wanted to do the rhexis and pushing a little bit of viscoelastic there so that there's a separation between the anterior vitreous space, and here trying to make a rhexis. And as we started, it was this is a little bit of a high speed video, so that's why you may feel those jerks. But as we went around, we realized that the rhexis was getting a little bigger. I was trying to keep it under check, putting in more viscoelastic at points, but it was tending to go almost the same size as my rhexis, which is not a good thing. It should always be a little smaller. And so you can see that it's tending to kind of go a little out of control. It's very unusual for this to happen because 90% of the time it is very well controlled. But since it was going like this, we managed to complete it, but it came out almost the same size. And I'll close in 5 seconds. The challenge was to put in the lens. We managed to put a 3-piece lens and did a capture. And we wanted to do a double capture. And as we tried to do that, pushing it on one side and the other side, we managed to dislocate the lens into the vitreous cavity, and then we had to kind of retrieve the lens. So this can be a challenge if your posterior rhexis is very big, and that's what I wanted to show. So then we put it out and brought it back and put it in the sulcus, and then did a single capture into the anterior capsular bag. With that, I think I'll stop. Thank you. I'm sorry, I would have loved to show 1 or 2 more videos, but we have to respect time. So
Thank you,
was
sir,
a very
but-
good learning experience.
Your videos
So
were
our next
excellent, sir.
speaker is
thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me for this meeting.
Thank you.
Very nice videos and very good surgery, Gaurav.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh.
So our next speaker is Dr. Hemant Anaspure.
Very nice presentation, Fairuz. Thank you, ma'am. It's so much of passion. I think you could go on and on. It's almost like an encyclopedia. So much to convey. But
Thank you, Dr. Hemant. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Gaurav Bhaiya, for
Hi, Dr.
joining.
Ragini. Good morning. Good afternoon, actually. Thank you so much for inviting us.
so
Yes.
Dr. Hemant is the Director, Pediatric Ophthalmologist and Strabismologist at Sri Sarveshwar Eye Hospital in Aurangabad. We'll be talking about myopia progression management.
Dr. Hemant? Dr. Hemant?
think so, has lost connection.
Dr. Hemant, you can please start your
I think he's
talk.
muted, so he'll probably need to unmute.
Yeah, Hemant, please
Yeah.
unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Huh? Yeah. We can't hear you. Talk. No, we can't hear you. I think you you leave and join again. You share the screen again. Till then, we'll take the next talk.
Okay, ma'am.
Hemant,
So
can you
Okay,
can you
okay.
be
I will be-
audible? Yeah. Start. We can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you, Thakre Madam and the MOS committee for giving me this opportunity. I will be talking about the myopia progression management. Okay, this is one of my own patients, and if you can see this thing.
Go to full
She
screen.
came to me when she was just 7 years old, and that time she presented only with the astigmatism in the both eyes. Okay,
Hemant,
and then I'm following her almost every year.
Hemant,
Like
please go on
if-
full screen. Please go on full screen.
Okay.
Yeah, you do. You press
Is it
down
full
here.
screen now?
No. Press on the right hand side down.
No, right side down. I have pressed. Now?
Mhm.
No?
No.
Go to the slideshow at the right hand corner.
Yeah.
Is it full screen now?
No.
Not yet.
Go down.
Well, I'm pressing this. I can see full screen on my screen, but
Okay, just go to the next slide. See if it is going to the next slide.
is it showing full screen now?
No.
No.
Next slide. I think we'll have to. You leave and
Go
join
to the
again.
slideshow. No. He has to just click the
Go to
presentation.
slideshow.
Slideshow. Gone to the new share.
Down.
It is showing and
No. Down, right and down.
Hemant.
oh,
Okay. Go ahead.
can you see a full screen now? Still no.
Yeah, but we are seeing 3 slides of introduction.
Oh,
So it's not full screen.
Okay, you can carry on.
I think it's okay. Let him carry on. It's fine. Hemant, carry on. No problem.
okay, sure. Can you hear me?
Clearly, we
Yes,
can hear you
we can
very
hear you.
clearly. Go ahead.
Okay. So I will just continue with this thing. Okay. So this is one of my patient whom actually I'm following since she was just 7 years old, and now she's 14 years. So last 7 years I'm following. If you look at her spherical part, initial part, almost first 4 or 5 years, there was no spherical component into the refraction. And then slowly from April 2018 or say January 19 to 20, there was started having a spherical equivalent. Okay, spherical, sorry, not equivalent, but spherical power into the glasses. And last 1 or 1.5 years, almost it has gone from -1 to -3.5. Okay, so this is just shows us that how much the myopia is increasing. One reason may be a lockdown effect, or we don't know, this increased screen time, but she has shown increase. Another part is
Please
myopia has increased
change
after
to
she
the next slide.
yeah, to the February to October. Now, as we see to the myopia is new epidemic the world is facing today. It is emerging as a public health problem. Some of the South Asian countries, they are showing a myopia prevalence as high as more than 50%. And other parts of the countries also it is increasing. In India, it is almost between 7.5 to 9.5%. But we have to remember that these are all studies which were done before the corona pandemic came, and now we don't know what is the situation now. But lockdown and global online teaching must have worsened the problem. Now, why we are worried about the increase in the myopia is not because of the number which is increasing, but it increase comes with the myopia complication as well, which are cataract or macular degeneration or retinal holes and tears and the glaucoma things. And it is one of the leading or second most cause to cataract of the visual impairment and blindness, the refractive error as such. So definitely we have to do something to prevent this myopia from progression. Coming to the factors, there are two factors, either a genetic or environmental factors. Genetic, there are multiple inheritance is there. There are so many loci or genes which are identified. Coming to the parents, which is very commonly parents ask, one parent if it is involved, the chances are almost double of getting the myopia. If the both parents are involved, it is almost 3 to 5 times. Now, environmental factor, which are we can say the
Hemant, your slides are not being shifted. We are just seeing the first slide.
Not shifted.
It's okay. I think let's carry on.
No. Okay. Yeah. Now.
Now go ahead.
Can you see now, at least in this?
Yes.
You can see the slide now, madam?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Okay.
Carry on.
Now, environmental factors which are increased near work, reduced outdoor activities, or these are some of the environmental factors which we can definitely modify. Now, myopia, we know very simple words that the focus, it is nearsighted, the focus come in front of the retina. And our aim of the treatment is to put the focus onto the retina. Now, how we are clinically manage this progression of the myopia? The environmental or genic condensation, outdoor activities, higher light intensities, then reducing the screen time, genetic factors. So there are basically three main things. Either we can go for environmental consideration, optical interventions, and the pharmacological therapies are there. Coming to the environmental factors, that like the outdoor activities, Sydney myopia study has shown that the more the exposure you have, at least more than 2 hours exposure per day outside, definitely can reduce the onset of myopia. But it is more effective in reducing the onset of myopia than slowing the progression. If the already child is myopic, then the chances are slightly lesser, but definitely it is one of the factors that we can consider. Higher light intensities usually increases the retinal dopamine production, which is believed to retard the axial length elongation. There are some reduced screen time, but we still don't know what is the ideal screen time for the different age groups. But usually I tell to the patient that the time the child spent outdoors, you can give a similar time in front of the screen and make sure that he will use a bigger screen and not the smaller screens like mobile. Now, genetic factors are there, but they are difficult to modify. Now, before going to the optical interventions, first thing we have to understand is what is a peripheral hyperopic defocus. This is one of the concepts where actually the myopic eyeball are not exactly circular. Like if you cut the circular shape and if you see, it is not exactly circular, but they have an oval or oblong shape. That's why whatever kind of a correction which you are giving, usually we'll have the image to fall on the center of the retina. But at the same time, because it is an oval shape, the images will fall behind the retina into the peripheral part. And that is called as a peripheral hyperopic defocus, which is considered as one of the important factor of why the eyeball keeps growing is only because of the peripheral hyperopic defocus. And many treatment are basically based on this principle that probably if we shift from hyperopic defocus to myopic defocus, probably we can prevent the myopia from progression. There are different optical interventions which we can have. One is a spectacle correction, either in terms of single vision glasses, which we definitely give in all the patients. Role of under correction is evaluated and studied, but it is shown that it doesn't work, the under correction part. Even it doesn't relax the accommodation and still the child will keep growing the myopia. So that is not something which will help us in reducing the myopia progression. Bifocal glasses or progressive additional lenses or executive bifocal are tried actually just to make sure that the peripheral hyperopic defocus should be corrected with the help of this plus power in and around the glasses. If we come, the spectacle as we know are very safe, but they are cosmetically slightly unacceptable and it is difficult, the progressive or bifocal, particularly during the sports activities. Similar to the spectacles, contact lenses have the same principle that the central focus, central distance is focused exactly onto the retina, but there will be peripheral rings with the near ad, which will create the peripheral myopic defocus and which can decrease the myopia progression. Orthocare lenses are shown as very effective in flattening the center of the retina, and they also help to reduce the myopia progression. But the major disadvantages with the contact lenses, one thing is the patient acceptance in our population. Parents as well as children are going to find it very difficult to use contact lenses. There is always a risk of infective keratitis. Then contact lens intolerance, rebound myopia is seen if you stop contact lenses at an early age. And again, the cost and other things are also there. Now coming to the pharmacological therapy, which is very well we are now using. All antimuscarinic these medications actually help, out of which atropine is what we are using nowadays. It is high dose atropine gives a better results definitely, but it comes with a more side effects compared to the low dose atropine, which is more effective with the less side effects. Now starting the atropine, you have to first assess the risk of the child, whether it is a low risk or a high risk children, before starting the treatment. Now, good parental counseling is something which I feel is very important, because many patients stop the treatment in between after 1 month or 2 months, and they come back saying that we stopped the drug, we couldn't get the drugs, or we couldn't continue with that. So good parental counseling is something which is very, very important when you're starting. First follow-up, usually after 2 months, whether they are comfortable, and then every 6 months, we have to keep following the child. And now assess the response. If we get a good or acceptable response, in a smaller child, we can continue with the drops. In an older child, probably we can consider tapering it. In a poor response, there are two things: either we can increase the dose or we can increase the concentration. Poor response, even despite the maximum atropine, then we'll have to consider some other different options. Now, all these children, we can actually follow them for 1 to 2 years, even after stopping the treatment, because they can have a rebound phenomenon. In conclusion, I will just say that management of myopia continues to evolve over the time. With a better understanding, probably we'll be able to manage it more. More work is required to determine how to combine all these therapies and how the treatment is safe in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Despite the glitch, it was a good informative talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
We next have Dr. Nikhil Rishikeshi. He heads the Department of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus at H.V. Desai Eye Hospital in Pune. And sir will be sharing some pearls in congenital cataract management with us. So you may start.
Yeah. Thank you, Moscon. Thank you, everyone, for this brilliant opportunity. And I shall be talking about pearls in pediatric cataract management, which in itself is a massive topic. I've tried to concise it as much as possible. I hope I'm audible and visible both.
Yes, sir.
All right. So all of us know these are various types of presentations that we see: bilateral cataracts, monocular cataract, congenital cataracts. And we come up with, we are faced with all these complications as well: capsular phimosis, traumatic cataracts with Zommer rings, again, another trauma. All of these are, but this is our aim: a nice, clear visual axis with a well-centered IOL. Other than the normal lamellar zonular cataracts, we see a lot of aniridia with cataracts, typical iris colobomas, a lot of traumas, and a brilliant talk by Dr. Rajesh Sinha has already illustrated all of them. But you can see the corneal tear out here, and you can see the blunt trauma with rosettes. Complicated cataracts are also there. So I'm not going into the etiology and the incidence prevalence, obviously for want of time. The management generally, all the investigations are generally reserved for the bilateral cases, because the unilateral are mostly either idiopathic or secondary to persistent fetal vasculature, unless proven otherwise. For the bilaterals, you need a full blood count, serum glucose, blood calcium, phosphorus. Hypocalcemias are known to cause cataracts, galactokinase levels. Torch test, obviously, nowadays a lot of rubella cataracts all of us are seeing. Urine analysis for reducing substances in galactosemia, amino acids for Loeys, the oculocerebrorenal syndrome. So what is a visually significant cataract? Do we need to address or operate all the cataracts? This is, I think, an important point. Any visual central opacity which is larger than 3 mm is a visually significant cataract if it is involving all the zones, that is the thickness of the crystalline lens. If there are clear zones and there is a good retinoscopic glow, a good fundoscopic glow, you can still hold on if there is not too much of low vision amblyopia or amblyopia. So nystagmus, strabismus obviously present are definite indicators of early intervention. And poor central fixation after 8 weeks is a very clear indicator. But then if the retinoscopy and the fundoscopy direct, this is where the DO and the retinoscopy I still use in my OPD. Sometimes you are unable to tell whether how well the child is seeing. So this is a good indicator. The PFE with the low shunt and the PFE with the shunt, so the stronger shunt, we know that there will be more bleeding with the stronger shunt, but in the low shunt also there will be a little bit of bleeding possibly. Watch for the smaller optic nerves, those are probably for prognostic purpose. Smaller eye will be there. And with the bigger shunt, the lot of risk of intraocular bleed would be there. So phthisis chances should probably take into consideration. These are the lamellar cataracts. Some of them have good visual acuity despite the center location because they're not very close to the nodal point as the zonular cataracts are. So you can actually observe them for a while if you want to get through a very critical period, either systemically or anesthetically. Glare and contrast sensitivity problems can be a little bit of a downside because of the layers involved. Cortical cataracts, again, the vision can be very good. Blue dot cataracts, all of these. So when do you really operate? In a monocular cataract, you have to get in very early because deprivation amblyopia is very strong. You have to commit to aggressive post-op rehab like amblyopia therapy, patching, glasses, contact lenses, all of that. If you can, please address it before 6 weeks, anesthetically possible. That is the ideal period, critical period for monocular cataracts. Now the problem I always have to mention this, and this is a constant deterrent because if there is a monocular cataract and it is a smaller eye and the horizontal corneal diameter is not as long as we would want it to be, 10.25 mm or above, implanting an IOL is going to be a problem. And in a monocular cataract, that can be disastrous. People are saying, people in the West do say that the contact lens can be a good option, but sometimes in smaller eyes, the contact lens that can't be retained within the eye, it comes out very quickly. So this is a very, it's a gray zone. So very aggressive patching therapy, 1:1 with +18, +20 glasses, that can be a little bit of a deterrent, but you have to address it. Some people in the West are saying in Europe and US, they could just leave it alone. They don't address the monocular cataract sometimes. The bilaterals are much better for us as pediatric surgeons because the cataracts being symmetrical, there will be less chance of amblyopia. Whatever it will be bilateral. So if there is risk of anesthesia or mental retardation or other syndromic children, then you can operate both of the eyes together. Typically before 8 weeks is a good time. If you can, obviously operate them one at a time at a probably gap of 7 days. Onset after 7 years, you can actually wait, observe, and at leisurely pace, not very leisurely, but yeah, you can take your time. Will you put in an IOL? Very important. The infant aphakia treatment study, as all of us have, we are aware of it. It actually proves that there wasn't too much of difference as visual outcome was concerned. This was in uniocular cataracts, the comparison of implantation of IOL versus keeping the child aphakic with contact lens treatment. Now that contact lens treatment is a possibility out there. I'm not saying it's not possible here, but we have to take into consideration the hygiene, the economy, and all of that, the corneal hygiene, the corneal adverse effects. So in the IATS, it was said that the visual results were almost similar, but glaucoma was slightly higher in the aphakic group, and the second surgery, additional surgeries, were commoner in the IOL group. So these are the two downsides. So these are the usual formulae, SRK, SRKT. So all of us are probably sticking to the SRKT in general because it's the least predictive error that we can have across all the axial lengths. So so there are the two things, whether you can leave the child hyperopic initially, then that will be, you have to have good compliance for glasses and contact lenses. Otherwise the child will have amblyopia. The other is you can make the child emmetropic now, but he'll have a large myopic shift, normally up to 8, 10. And these are the ways that you can reduce the IOL, Elie Dahan's formula, or Rupal Trivedi group, Edward Wilson formula. You have to reduce that is the best way forwards, at least in the bilateral cataracts. Any of these formula is the rule of 7. So, okay, I'm really, now people are using the Barrett's quite a lot. Target post-op we just spoke about. We know that at birth, the axial length could be 16.6 to 17 mm, and keratometry would be 50, 51 diopters. So, and then it evolves very rapidly over the first 6 months. And within the first year, almost 90% of eye growth is reached. So that is where putting an IOL in the first year can be a big challenge. We know that we need a clear axis. So addressing the posterior capsule is very important, but we do know that the pupil doesn't dilate much. The cornea has reduced, the sclera is reduced rigidity. Anterior capsule is quite elastic, and positive vitreous thrust can be quite a bit of a problem. So you have to be careful there. So you can't put in too much of dilating drops, because that itself can cause cloudy cornea. Corneal tunnel is the preferred way, and they don't self-seal. So I was very interested showing us that additional, of course, he's shown it before, and it's a brilliant technique. I do prefer to suture all my ports, all the 3 ports. I prefer a superior incision. It gets covered properly by the upper lid and protected by the Bell's phenomenon. Temporal, although it's more accessible, it's more accessible to trauma as well. Instruments are important. The anterior chamber can collapse very easily because of the vitreous thrust. That's where the high viscosity viscoelastic devices come in. So Ken Nischel's technique, vitrector X, is not something that I would prefer, but hydrodissection. Be very careful, because quite a few of them can have PC dehiscence, primary PC dehiscence or polar cataracts. So if at all you want to do hydrodissection, it has to be multi-quadrant and small quantities at one time, not a large gush that will just open up the PC. It's generally irrigation aspiration, and you have to do a good PPC and a good anterior vitrectomy. That is absolutely important. Do have a high vitrectomy cut rate so that there's less traction on the vitreous. We don't want the complications of retinal detachment or CME. So this is what an ideal picture, this is what we are happy seeing. And in the bag IOL with a clear peer, this one, central. I don't have time for a video, right?
No, not really, sir.
No, okay, great. So I'll just wind up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So that was a very informative talk. And our next speaker is Dr. Reshma Mehta. She is a pediatric ophthalmologist and also has a special interest in ROP screening and management. She would be talking about refraction in children today. Ma'am, you may share your screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank MOS. You can hear me and you can see the screen now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So I thank MOS and the MOS Scientific Committee and also Dr. Thackeray ma'am to give me this opportunity to speak about refraction in children on this platform. An expert group of pediatric ophthalmologists from across the country met under aegis of AIOS and deliberated to reach a consensus for managing pediatric eye condition. The purpose of this consensus was to enable all ophthalmologists to have a broad set of guidelines for managing pediatric eye conditions, which are divided in 3 categories. The pediatric
Your slides are not moving.
Pediatric eye examination, pediatric refraction, and amblyopia management. The economic impact of pediatric vision loss is huge and evident only after a child reaches adulthood. The pediatric population with refractive error needs regular assessment. Prescription should be adjusted according to the eye growth, and we know that the cornea reaches adult size by 2 years. The eye continues to grow anteroposteriorly from 16 millimeters to 24 millimeters. These 2 variables do not have a parallel growth. Hence, refractive error changes as children age. Determining and correcting a child's refractive error prevents and treats amblyopia, which ultimately helps to avoid the irreversible vision loss. The refractive error typically moves from hyperopia towards myopia as children age. Children between 2 to 6 years of age need complete refractive correction. If any myopia develops between 6 to 9 years of age, it increases up to adolescence. Astigmatism is relatively uncommon. as Dr. Nikhil has just pointed out, that the keratometry value is 51 diopters in a newborn, and in adult it is 43 diopters, which reaches by the age of 2 years. Hence, the focusing power of eye decreases as age advances. To begin with, the visual assessment should be done as one eye at a time. Using the age-appropriate methods, for less than 2.5 years, we use the fixation target following movements, preferential looking charts. From 2.5 to 4 years, we use symbols, alphabets, matching cards. Above 4 years, we use the Snellens and the Logmar charts. A complete eye examination, cover test, extraocular movements, convergence, anterior segment examination, fundus, and complete squint examination is to be done. Assessment of the refractive error requires a complete cycloplegic refraction. That is the rule in children. It is because of the presence of strong accommodation. Cycloplegic refraction is done to reveal the total refractive status of the eye when accommodation is at rest. We use atropine, homatropine, and cyclopentolate eye drops. Important point is to keep in mind is the proper cycloplegia should be achieved, and this should be verified by performing dynamic retinoscopy while the child looks at distant and near objects, which reveals a constant value. Atropine drops are avoided as risk of systemic absorption and side effects is higher. In age groups more than 5 years with orthophoria, homatropine and cyclopentolate can be used. However, side effects must be kept in mind, and parents should be forewarned for the ocular irritation, lacrimation, contact dermatitis, dryness of secretions, and fever, which are often seen. The gold standard of objective refraction in a child is retinoscopy. It is a vital aid in calculating accurate refractive error in children. Hence, mastering the skill is essential. Retinoscopy allows observer to accurately measure patient's refractive error by determining the spherical power, the cylindrical power, and the cylindrical axis. It also provides information about the additional ocular morbidity. We can use autorefractometers, but it induces proximal convergence in spite of cycloplegia, hence leading to mild undercorrection of hypermetropia. In young uncooperative children, it is difficult to convince the child to place the head on the autoref. Also, handheld autorefs can overcome this problem. The refractive status of a child is constantly changing with age. Neonates are hyperope with astigmatism. The hyperopia is symmetrical, which is less than 4 diopters. Astigmatism can be less than 2 diopters. Both hypermetropia and astigmatism reduce with age. E-metropization has to be taken into account when prescribing glasses. Child less than 2 years, if has myopic error, this correction is not required. But if the child is above 2 to 6 years, undercorrection should be avoided. Overcorrection should be avoided. I'm extremely sorry. For myopes, we should not overcorrect. The lowest minus power needed for the best visual acuity should be given. So according to the ACOS chart, in myopia, if it is less than 1 year and the myopia is more than 4 diopters, we have to think about it, as the child is only going to focus for near objects. But more than 2 to 3 years, we need to correct the myopia. Coming to hypermetropia, it should be corrected earlier than myopia. Children having strong accommodation, which can overcome minimal amount of hypermetropia with ease. So this minimal amount of hypermetropia of 2.5 to plus 1.5 can be overcome. But children who are having more than plus 5 diopters of hypermetropia, we cannot neglect it. It has to be corrected completely and fully at age 1, 2, and 2 to 4. Because the amount of accommodation needed for near tasks would be in the range of plus 8, which can cause asthenopia. Amblyopia and esotropia are the most common outcomes of uncorrected hypermetropia. Amblyopia occurs if the child cannot overcome hyperopia at all times, especially for near. Low amount of hypermetropia leads to refractive accommodative esotropia and increases the risk of amblyopia. Hence, amount of hyperopia to be corrected depends on age. Mild undercorrection can be prescribed to allow some accommodation to occur. But undercorrection of hypermetropia should be equal in both eyes, and as accommodation is a binocular phenomenon. Hypermetropia with esotropia in these patients, again a cover test is mandatory prior to installation of cycloplegic. 2 to 5 diopters of hypermetropia present with squint should be corrected completely. More than 5 diopters of hypermetropia, these patients do not squint because of lack of accommodative effort for such a high power. Coming to the last part of astigmatism, accommodation can change only spherical it can change the spherical refractive status of the eye by change in curvature of the crystalline lens. It cannot be overcome by accommodation. So this astigmatism will not be overcome by accommodation. Hence, the cylindrical power of 1.5 to 2 diopters can be amblyogenic. And according to this APOS guidelines, we need to correct both the meridians entirely and prevent amblyopia. Small cylindrical powers should be corrected completely. Spectacle fitting and centration is an important factor in high cylindrical powers. Parents should be explained importance of centration, as children often bend their frames, and prompt repair and tightening should be done properly. These practice patterns, which were designed, will enable the ophthalmologist to provide efficient pediatric eye care services and timely intervention for avoidable or preventable cause of blindness. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a great talk. So our last speaker for today is Dr. Pradna Deshmukh. She is an associate professor and VR surgeon at MGM Medical College, Aurangabad, and she has a special interest in ROP and diabetic retinopathy. Ma'am would be talking about screening techniques and management of ROP. Ma'am, please start.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes. So thank you, boss, office bearers, and Dr. Thackeray for inviting me for this talk. So I'll be speaking about screening, examination technique and management of ROP, what's new and what already being practiced. So as we travel from retrolental fibroplasia to retinopathy of prematurity, we all know that it's a disease of the smallest and sickest infants. But in Indian scenarios, we have larger babies also coming up with ROP, and the incidence varies from 38% to 51.9%, and with the more premature infants surviving because of better NICU practices, we are going to see an epidemic of this disease in future. So today we'll be covering why, whom, when, where and how of ROP. So why should you screen? It is a blinding disease. Identification of all babies at risk is essential to prevent blindness as well as undesirable sequelae of this. Whom to screen? Now the guidelines that are followed are the Rashtriya Bal Swasthya Karyakram Guidelines 217. It says that we should screen all babies with birth weight less than 2 kgs, gestational age less than 34 weeks, gestational age between 34 to 36 weeks but with risk factors, and all infants with unstable clinical course who are high risk, as told by the neonatologist. The when to screen remains the same. Everyone should be screened before 1 month of life, and the babies who have less than 1.2 kg birth weight or less than 28 weeks gestational age should be screened earlier to detect APROP at a very early stage. Where to screen? A warm, clean place. Can be NICU, can you be your OPD, can be the pediatrician OPD, but the treatment should be done only in NICU and OT as this babies needs monitoring. We all have learned indirect ophthalmoscopy with 28 or 20 diopter lenses, scleral depression, and this is how we have learned to do ROP screening. However, there has been a shift to the digital methods of screening technique. So the digital method can be contact, which is the RedCam or the RedCam shuttle, the non-contact with the advent of a really nice smartphones, or even the wide field photography where the baby can be put in a flying baby position. The advantages of digital screening is that it's a very good tool in telemedicine. So you can take your screening to a very remote area where the babies do not have access to the traditional screening. It is a very good counseling tool for follow-up, better for medico-legal documentation, and it is supposed to cause less pain and stress to the baby. The follow-up schedule will depend upon the retina. It might be bi-weekly for an immature retina, or can be as early as 48 hours for a ROP which is type 2. The ICROP has traditionally classified this into zones, clock hours and stages. However, ICROP has been revamped in the recent times to the 3rd edition. Why the need was there to revamp this? This was because there was subjective interpretation of disease classification, and there have been recent advances in both imaging as well as treatment with the advent of anti-VEGF, which has changed the post-treatment sequelae. There are different patterns of ROP like blister ROP, bleb-like ROP or hybrid ROP that really does not fall into the classification gamut. Now the major recommendation of ICROP is it has divided the zones into a posterior zone 2, which is the margin between the zone 1 and the zone 2, a notch, which is an incarceration of ROP into a more posterior zone. It has classified pre-plus disease into mild and severe. Okay, and also has provided sample images. The acute disease stage has recommended the use of aggressive ROP in place of AP ROP, and instead of using immature retina or no ROP, to use incomplete vascularization. Retinal detachment, also the stage 5 retinal detachment has been divided into stage 5A, 5B and 5C. The regression, reactivation and long-term sequelae also has been defined by this ICROP classification. The treatment protocol remains the same. Type 1 ROP requires treatment and the type 2 ROP requires close observation. Now this is a multidisciplinary thing. It requires the ophthalmologist, the neonatologist, the nursing staff and the parents. The treatment option, the gold standard is the laser, and the anti-VEGF is coming up. Surgery is for stage 4 and stage 5 ROP, and more focus on prevention and new therapies. Now current gold standard is a laser in which there is peripheral laser ablation. It has to be done within 48 hours after informed consent, as I said, in NICU or OT under topical sedation, GA, whichever it is. Anesthesia required, not without its complication. The main is myopia and anterior segment ischemia. Everybody should have their own set SOP for the laser procedure, which has led to the emergence of anti-VEGF as one of the potential treatment for ROP. Now the indications are a very posterior ROP or as a preoperative measure. The dosage is half to 1/3. Now what are the points in favor of the laser on the anti-VEGF? So laser is the current gold standard. It is endpoint treatment, but it is not without its complication. There is more myopia, very stressful, time consuming. It is difficult to do it in a unstable baby with a non-dilating pupil, whereas the anti-VEGF has its own medico-legal issues, but it is easier to do it in a non-dilating pupil, easier to do posterior ROP, less myopia, it is less stressful and less time consuming. Not without its hazard. As I said, my preferred practice pattern is I use it only in zone 1 ROP, where even the macula is not vascularized, and I usually use a combination of anti-VEGF and laser to treat my babies. There have been trials, will not talk about this because of time constraint. Have to remember that other than ROP, the child can have glaucoma, cataract, refractive errors such as myopia, anisometropia, astigmatism and strabismus, which require close evaluation and management. Now, the baby can have subnormal vision with or without ROP. So, the causes can be an unfavorable structural outcome in spite of treatment, CVI, strabismus, myopia, and every baby on follow-up requires a thorough checkup, both visual and other milestones. Vision can be checked uniocularly or binocularly. Ocular alignment such as strabismus, nystagmus has to be changed along with the retinal examination. Refractive error, myopia, anisometropia, astigmatism have to be evaluated, and keeping in mind the other comorbidities like cataract and glaucoma. Now, as you can see, all the treatment have complications, both systemic and occur. So, can you prevent ROP? There are things that have been tried, like using an optimal oxygen level. So, oxygen is a drug. The role of antenatal steroids, which help respiratory maturation, optimal nutrition like breast milk, decrease the blood sampling and decrease the nosocomial infection. The future strategy, two of the most promising are propranolol and vitamin A, which are novel treatment, can be given both orally or as eye drop, which can reduce ROP progression by inhibiting the pathological angiogenesis. A note on AI in ROP. Now, this can be used to study the images, so better application to demarcate and grade the ROP and decide the schedule of follow-up. So it has a role in telemedicine. Stem cells in ROP have been studied extensively in animal models of oxygen-induced retinopathy, and they have found promising results that it can help normalize the pathological vascularization. However, can it be translated into human trials? It remains to be seen. So last but not the least, everybody who does ROP has to have some faith in God, but we have to keep our powder dry. So document, and take adequate professional indemnity. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a marathon session and we have come to the end of our talks. Dr. Ragini, ma'am, if we could have some closing remarks from you.
She's not there. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all these speakers. We are overshot the time quite a bit actually. Thank you. Any comments before we leave? Mr. Kotkar, madam? Sinha, sir?
It was an excellent speech, academic speech, where we could see cataract, refraction, myopia, allergic conjunctivitis. Excellent session.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
And of course, the progression in myopia.
Une, madam.
And I just like the videos which were shared, and congratulate all the speakers. They have done excellent job, and even ROP was also much needed and wonderful talk by each and every speaker. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sinha sir, for giving your precious time to us. I think Ludra sir has left. I think we will leave now. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mitali. Thank you all. I missed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thakur. Bye.
Oh, thank you, Reshma. Sorry.